Episode 22, The Fast Food Killer. Hey y'all, I'm Heather and this is Poison Appalachia, the dark side of Appalachia. As always, thank you all for listening. I hope you enjoyed my last episode on the Slaughter family. That one makes me sad, and just them never giving up and never getting a true answer. And it happened on Christmas Eve of all things. Just heartbreaking. Speaking of Christmas though, did y'all have a good Christmas? I usually take the whole week of Christmas off, so I enjoyed not working for a week. It's just my mama and I, so it's a low-key Christmas for us. The last episode of the year is here. I didn't know when I started this in August if it would last this long, but it has, and it's going well, I think. I really would like to grow this podcast this year. I hope to be more successful, reach out and get more listeners and people, excited about it. um, I'm going to make a vision board for my goals for this podcast for the upcoming year. And I know vision boards sound corny, but I made one from last year to run a half marathon, which is something I never thought I would do, and I did it. So I feel like, putting it out there helps get it back to you. I think you have to manifest the good vibes sometimes, Do any of you have any goals or make resolutions? I know people think they don't work, and sometimes they don't. But I think sometimes we just don't, have a specific goal. It's just too broad of a subject, like lose weight. Well, yeah, you'll probably lose some weight, but if you don't make it a specific goal, then it seems like you failed the resolution, and maybe you haven't. Does that make sense? So, I don't exactly make resolutions, but I do have goals, and I try to do everything I can to make it possible. So, not only do I plan to grow this podcast, I plan to get back into running again this year. No half marathons though. 5K is about the extent of it this year. When I started this podcast, I kind of stopped running because I had, a new obsession, had to focus on the podcast, and I felt like I didn't have time to run. But now that I kind of have this down to a routine, I think I can start running again, and I'd like to get in better shape. I'm definitely not in good shape. But enough about that. Let's get on to today's podcast. This is about Paul Dennis Reid, nicknamed the Fast Food Killer. And this episode there's a lot of murders and violence in it. So if that's not, what you're into, you may want to skip this one. This one didn't happen. I mean, it happened, in the last 20 years or so, or 30, I guess anymore. But in the late 1990s, Paul Dennis Reid's name would become synonymous with terror. Between February and May of 1997, he embarked on a brutal killing spree that targeted fast food restaurants, leaving multiple victims in his wake. So I tried to look up stuff on his childhood. At first I couldn't find a lot, but then, digging deeper, I did find some. So this is what I found. He was born in 1957 in Richland Hills, Texas, which is a small community a bit out of the Dallas-Fort Worth area. It's really small. The population was 225 as of the 2020 census. Paul Reid's father was an alcoholic, and his mother left him and one of his sisters, Janet, with Paul Reid Sr. when Paul Dennis Reid was 4. His mom, Josephine Mary, took the other sister with her. Paul Reid Sr. was a private eye and a repo man, and he did a lot of other odd jobs, so he just wasn't around much. So Paul Dennis Reid was primarily raised by his grandmother, and she wouldn't really discipline him. Her name was Josephine, and she was very conservative and very religious. So I think she just kind of thought maybe she could pray it out of him. Paul Dennis Reid was born with brain damage. As a child, he had a congenital abnormality in his left ear, which some believe caused his brain to atrophy. He had hearing loss as a kid. It did affect him. He was behind in learning and growing. He couldn't even put together simple sentences until well after the age of 3 years old. He didn't go to school until he was 7. He seemed like one of those kids that was just born to be bad, if you know what that's like. I mean, I don't know, is it possible? Sounds like it was with Paul. And maybe it was due to the brain damage, or maybe he had an undiagnosed mental disorder, such as ADHD or something worse. But by the age of 5, Paul was getting into trouble a lot. As soon as he could reach them, he was stealing mail from neighbors' mailboxes and clothes off their lines. He even stole a wallet from a guy in a department store at 5 years old. I don't think I would have thought to do that, any of that in a million years when I was that age, or any age, to be honest. He He was violent towards other children and towards animals. Neighbors were getting upset and angry, which I definitely would have been angry too if he were my neighbor. His grandmother was running out of options of what to do with him, so she would just tie him to the chair. Some of the neighbors even came after him, but he usually would run away and escape them. Paul and his grandmother never got along. He was violent to her from the start. He once put nails in her soup. When she found out, he just sat there and smiled. When he was 5, his grandmother was sleeping in bed and smelled smoke. Her bed was on fire. Paul had set fire to it at 5. He even beat her dog to death with a baseball bat. All of this before he went to school. Poor grandma, she took him in and he treated her awful. But she never tried to discipline him, so maybe you reap what you sow. I don't know, but I just feel bad for her. Around the age of 5, Paul was hit in the head with a brick by a friend. Knowing how he treated everyone, no wonder the kid had friends like that. This was his first head trauma. This left him dizzy and with memory issues. Like I said, he didn't go to school until he was 7. His stepmother was the one that finally enrolled him in school. He had a really hard time adjusting to school and was a troublemaker. The school sent him to a school psychologist, and she diagnosed him with minimal cerebral dysfunction, which she said it would explain his learning difficulties and his behavior. Minimal cerebral dysfunction is an outdated term that was once used to describe a condition characterized by subtle neurological deficits that affect a child's behavior, learning, and motor coordination. I mean, the way this kid was behaving, I think it was more than minimal, but I'm not a psychologist either, so. The diagnosis did nothing to help him, though, because they didn't do anything to try to change his behavior. They did try to put him in a special school, but the school was primarily African-American school, and he actually made several friends there and was doing pretty well, but this was in the middle of the Civil Rights era, and they quickly moved him to another school, which didn't help any. Finally, his grandma decided to send him to a school for boys, the Bernard Balin Boys' Home. It was primarily for children with behavioral problems. It didn't seem to help him either, and his father decided to give him up for adoption. When his mother found out about that, she took him in and back into her home. By this time, his mom was remarried and had 2 other daughters. She enrolled Paul in a primary school for special education. He started making friends, but still had behavioral problems. His doctors put him on medication that seemed to help a bit. By the time he got to high school, he was put back into regular schooling. At the age of 13, he fell off his bike and fractured his skull, which led him to spending several months in a hospital. When he returned to school, the other students picked on him and called him Special Ed. But he did make some friends while there, but then he got hit by a car while riding his bicycle and received another injury. So, poor kid. I mean, he was a bad kid, but I don't think he deserved all that. But Paul started breaking into houses and stealing cars and started using drugs. At this time, he was staying with his aunt who would do drugs with her, but he tried to sexually assault her and she kicked him out. At the age of 16, Paul was convicted of car theft and given a suspended sentence of 3 years. He dropped out of school and began working. By 1979, he started to get his life together a bit. He got a job as a mechanic at an oil company. He also met his future wife, Jessica Neal. He still wasn't a great dude, apparently, because one of his sisters tried to talk Jessica out of the marriage, but it didn't work. They got married, and quickly he became very controlling and abusive to her. Although part of his life seemed to be getting together, he still continued to commit crimes. He was arrested for theft and illegal checks several times. In fact, he had an old high school friend that he began robbing restaurants with. They used weapons, so you know what that means. Yep, armed robbery. Paul was arrested in 1982 for aggravated armed robbery of 4 restaurants and 1 general store. At first, he was deemed mentally incapable to stand trial. So then he stole city equipment to try to start his own business. Right before the trial, they had hearings to see if he was competent to stand trial. This time, he was very theatrical. He fell backwards in his chair in court, shot paper with a rubber band. He then wore a paper hat and then put it on the lawyer's head. He did all this while the jury was present, but he acted normal when they were out of the room. The judge realized pretty quickly what he was doing, and he was deemed competent to stand trial. For this, he was convicted of aggravated robbery and sentenced to 20 years in prison. The thing is, he probably was incompetent to stand trial, and if he hadn't acted like a fool, he may have not had to stand trial. So his wife, Jessica, divorced him while he was in prison in Texas. She was probably just relieved to get away from him. It was while he was in prison that he started getting paranoid. He thought the government was controlling his mind. He said it was a program called Scientific Technology. Not very creative a name, but whatever. He would write letters claiming he was under surveillance going all the way back to 1985. In 1990, he was released from prison after serving only 7 years. He was released on parole. This was actually against the advice of several experts, but the prison was overcrowded, so they released him, which definitely was a bad idea. He went to Dallas and got a job as a delivery truck driver. While on the job, he was involved in a pretty serious auto accident. He hit his head again and lost consciousness and had a bad concussion. He received $25,000 in a settlement. He used the settlement money on plastic surgery and braces. His goal was to become a country singer, and he thought altering his appearance would help. He learned to play the guitar and moved to Nashville, Tennessee, and he took the stage name Justin Parks. Now, I don't know if he ever had any aspirations of becoming a country singer before this, or if this was just something he decided after the accident. But he was off to Nashville to start his career. Unfortunately, he was becoming more paranoid and said that the government was controlling him, and he was afraid they would make him use violence. He sent a bunch of letters out to people stating this, but it was pretty much ignored. Paul was also acting weirder and weirder in general, not just paranoid, just weird. When his father died, he showed up to the funeral wearing a t-shirt, shorts, and tennis shoes, and a Burger King crown on his head. He referred to himself as King Paul. No one really seemed to do much about this, though, or apparently weren't concerned enough because he just continued to go on with his life. He had a short temper and was very impulsive. His family members became very afraid of him. He had gotten a new girlfriend for a bit, and she said living with him was like walking on eggshells. One night, he picked her cat up and threw it across the room. Then he tried to smother the girlfriend with a pillow and held it on her until she was almost dead before he let up. This ended the relationship. I mean, if he'd thrown my cat across the room, that would have done it for me. He wouldn't have had a chance to try to smother me. But Paul wasn't having a lot of luck with his country career. So he got a job at Shoney's in Nashville. Shoney's is an American restaurant chain headquartered in Nashville, Tennessee. They serve like all-American diner type food, just a casual sit-down restaurant, if you've never heard of it. They have a salad bar. We used to have a Shoney's across the river in Point Pleasant, West Virginia, and it was one of my grandpa's favorite places to eat. So we ate at Shoney's a lot. But anyways, enough about Shoney's, I guess. This isn't a Shoney's commercial or anything. Paul lied about his age when he got the job, so the restaurant couldn't find him in the police records. He seemed to have did a good job there, and people thought he was a nice guy. But in 1997, he got mad and threw a dish at another employee. He was fired for this. He thought this was very unfair, and this enraged him. This somehow flipped a switch in him, and he committed a string of awful crimes. But before I get to that, something I've noticed about the description of him is that it's almost like he has two different personalities. And I never saw that he was ever diagnosed with that, but there's like the guy that's the hard worker, everyone seems to like, and then there's Crazy Paul, the one you can't trust, and the one that has an awful temper. Just my observation, but maybe that's how he got away with things, as long as he did. I mean, all the brain damage he had is no wonder, but I don't know if he was ever diagnosed with anything like that, like I said. However, like I said, a switch was flipped, and this set him off on the start of a murder spree. On the morning of February 16th, 1997, Paul went to Captain D's restaurant. Captain D's is similar to Long John Silver's. It's a fast food seafood restaurant. And it's actually owned by Shoney's. a little bit of trivia there. Oddly enough, I worked at Captain D's when all this happened. I was in Ohio, of course. I don't remember this happening, though. You'd think I would have. But, times were a little different then, I guess. Or maybe I just have a bad memory. The series of events really started the night before. It was closing time, and he entered through the exit door and asked if they were hiring. They explained that they were closing and for him to show up the next day to get an application. So the next morning, before they even open, Paul shows up at the Captain D's restaurant. Steve Hampton, the manager, comes out. Steve had a wife and family and worked at Captain D since he was 15. And this was before the store opened, so Steve met Paul at the door. They talked for a minute, and Paul convinced Steve to let him in the restaurant. Paul locked the door behind him and pulled out his gun. There was one other employee in the store, 16-year-old Sarah Jackson. Paul pulls out his gun and demands that Steve and Sarah go to the walk-in cooler. Steve told him he had $600 in his wallet and asked him to take it and leave them be, which I guess was his rent money. But unfortunately, Paul made them go stay in the walk-in cooler and lay face down on the floor. He then proceeded to shoot them numerous times, killing both of them. Paul then goes to the cash register and gets $7,000, and then gets the $600 off of Steve. The 10 a.m. employee got there and was unable to enter the restaurant, so he called another Captain D's, and they called the police. When officers entered the building, they found Steve and Sarah dead in the cooler. This will become relevant later, but there was a man on the highway about 11 miles away from the Captain D's location picking up cans, and he found the content of Steve's wallet, cards and pictures and stuff, and he called the police. Paul, meanwhile, waited until 3 days after the murder and went to a car dealership he'd been at earlier in the month. He put $2,000 down on a lease that he'd been looking at. The dealer thought it was a little odd, but Paul told him he had just been working really hard around the clock to get the money. So now Paul has a car, which means he can get away easier. So about a month later, on March 23rd, 1997, about 3 miles from the Captain D's, Paul goes to a McDonald's parking lot, waiting for the store to close at midnight. Paul gets out of the car and ambushes 3 employees at gunpoint as they're leaving the building. He made them go back into the restaurant. He then shoots the 3 employees, Robert Santiago, who was the manager, Jose Gonzalez, Andrea Michelle Brown, and then Robert N. Sewell. He was the 4th employee in the building, and Paul went to shoot him, and his gun jammed. Jose Gonzalez then fought him. Paul had a knife and stabbed Jose 17 times. 17 times. But somehow Jose survived. The interesting thing about this is Jose didn't speak any English, but the manager, Robert, was Puerto Rican, so he could communicate with him. Robert told Jose if he ever needed to call 911 and say, "I don't speak English, but there's an emergency." So actually, Jose ended up doing just that. Paul Reid ended up with a little over $3,000 from the safe there. And then almost a month later, on April 23rd, 1997, Paul drove to Baskin-Robbins in Clarksville, Tennessee. He got to the location about 10 p.m., right around closing time. 2 women were working, Angela Holmes and Michelle Mace. Somehow Paul convinced them to let him inside. He robbed the cash register and safe, but instead of killing them there, he forced both of them into the car. He'd heard that Michelle's brother would be there to pick her up, which is why the change of plans, rather than just killing them there. Michelle's brother got there to pick her up and couldn't find her. He felt there was something off and he called 911. When the police arrived, they noticed the cash register and safe were empty, but they couldn't find Angela or Michelle. They did find their purses untouched. Paul took them both to Dunbar Cave State Park. It was a place he was very familiar with. The caves were only about 3 miles from Baskin-Robbins. He killed Angela by cutting her throat, but Michelle took off running. Unfortunately, he caught her and killed her too. The police found their bodies the next day. Then about 2 months later, on June 12, 1997, Paul went to the home of Mitchell Roberts. Mitchell's the one that was the manager at Shoney's that fired Paul. Paul had a knife and gun on him. His plan was to kidnap Mitchell. But Mitchell didn't really suspect anything. He just thought Paul was coming to ask for his job back. He stated he was very friendly and nothing seemed out of the ordinary at that point. Luckily, Mitchell's son was there at the time. He had a video camera he was playing with. Fortunately, Paul noticed the boy was recording in the background, so he left. But it was such a strange encounter that Mitchell ended up decided to call the police. So the police were watching restaurants looking for a pattern. I mean, the pattern is about monthly, probably when he ran out of money. But, they weren't really getting anywhere, and they couldn't really find out where it was going to happen next either. And until Mitchell called them. The police went to Paul's house and questioned him, and they found enough evidence that they decided to arrest him. When they started looking into everything, Paul kept coming up as a match. His shoe size matched the prints found at the scene. It wasn't the exact pair of shoes. He had gotten rid of those, apparently. But it was the same size and similar shoes that matched the prints. They took his fingerprints, and his thumbprint was a match for the fingerprint on Hampton's cards. Hampton was the Captain D's manager, and he's the one that the person picking up cans found his wallet. See, I told you it would come back. And then the police went to Jose Gonzalez, and he positively ID'd him. Also, Captain D's employees from the night before, where he stopped by to ask for a location, they positively identified him. The police found DNA on the 2 Baskin-Robbins employees, on their shoes, and also fiber in his car matching them. They found traces of blood from the McDonald's incident in his car, too. So he wasn't, he didn't try to hide anything, really. I think he just thought he wasn't going to get caught, and he didn't worry about it. But Reid was convicted on 7 counts of first-degree murder across 3 trials. Jurors from West and East Tennessee were brought in and sequestered because the judge determined that the overwhelming media coverage in Nashville would prevent the selection of an unbiased jury from Middle Tennessee. There are 3 trials due to different jurisdictions and counties, but the case was pretty much cut and dry. There was a ton of evidence. The first trial for the Captain D's employees was in 1999, and he was found guilty of 2 counts of murder and sentenced to death for both. The next trial was Baskin-Robbins employees, also in 1999. This one he was found guilty on 2 counts of murder and 2 counts of kidnapping, and was sentenced to death 2 more times. The third trial was in 2000 for the McDonald's employees. Paul was found guilty and sentenced to death 3 times, plus 25 years for aggravated assault. That was on Jose Gonzalez, who survived, luckily. So a total of 7 death sentences for Paul. His 7 death sentences are the most handed down ever to a single person in the state of Tennessee. He never admitted to the murders, but the evidence was stacked up against him too much to find anything but guilty. The problem came with the sentencing. Paul was scheduled to be executed in 2003. He'd been found guilty in everything, but his sister was a lawyer now, and she got a stay of execution the day before the execution. And put that on delay, unfortunately. She wanted to see if he was competent or not, and whether it should be held against him. If he should be held accountable for what he did. I just have to say, damn it, Janet. But Paul never fought it. He was just willing to accept the punishment, but Janet had other ideas. Janet, along with anti-death penalty activists, claimed he was mentally handicapped and unable to make such a decision, and filed multiple motions. Some were successful, some were unsuccessful to stay his execution. However, the Tennessee Supreme Court upheld all of Reid's sentences. Reid's case received national attention among anti-death penalty activists. Following his convictions, they argued he was not able to make sound legal decisions. Reid displayed erratic decision-making, choosing to appeal some verdicts and not others, and professing his will to die as sentenced after having fought to avoid such a fate earlier in his defense. At the same time, Reid exhibited public signs of paranoia, calling his defense team actors, and claiming it was part of a United States government mind control project, still called scientific technology, that monitored his every move. In cross-examinations, the prosecution attempted to counter this defense by claiming Reid was a crafty con artist, using these delusions as a defense mechanism. I think there's no doubt he was mentally impaired. That many brain injuries, probably things aren't percolating quite right in the brain. But that doesn't make the people any less dead or make him any more innocent. Me personally, I'm actually against the death penalty, but some things I think do warrant it, and I think this could have been one of them. He just killed too many people and would probably have never stopped if he hadn't got caught. Unfortunately for the victims' families, they didn't get the closure they wanted. Reid was not executed because he died at the Nashville General Hospital at Meharry on November 1st, 2013, 11 days before his 56th birthday. The cause of death was from complications due to pneumonia, heart failure, and upper respiratory issues. Reid had been in the hospital for about 2 weeks. None of the families knew any of this, and then suddenly it was just announced that he was dead. So I don't think they were very happy about that, and I don't blame them. It's just kind of a crappy ending to it all. But I guess he at least finally paid for his crimes. I don't know. It's just sad. You think a job like working in a restaurant would be a pretty low-risk job. You never think about going to work and it being your last time. But there are risks, I guess, with any job and anywhere. Heck, you could go to the grocery store and get shot down. It's just always a good idea to be vigilant and always on the lookout, because you never know what danger's out there. I actually had a cousin who was a pizza delivery guy, and he got murdered. It's just so tragic. I think the best bet in life is always just to watch your back and always be alert. Not to be a downer, but it's the truth. We're always in danger. Sometimes we just don't know it. Unfortunately, Paul Dennis Reid was not the only serial killer in Nashville, Tennessee. From 1975 to 2007, there were several serial killers in Nashville. And I'd like to do an upcoming episode on this. So, what is it about Nashville that makes it easier for serial killers to work? So many people go there to live their dreams and it falls apart. Maybe that just makes them easier victims. Who knows? But it's definitely something I plan to cover on an upcoming episode. But Nashville isn't all serial killers and murders. Quite the opposite, really. Nashville's often known as Music City, is the capital and most populous city in Tennessee. It's in the county seat of Davidson County, located in Middle Tennessee. It has a population of 689,447 people. It's the 21st most populous city in the United States and the fourth most populous city in the southeastern U.S. It's located on the Cumberland River. The city is the center of the Nashville metropolitan area. It's one of the fastest growing areas in the nation. It was named for Francis Nash, a general of the Continental Army during the American Revolutionary War. The city was founded in 1779 when this territory was still considered part of North Carolina. The city grew quickly due to its strategic location as a port on the Cumberland River and in the 19th century a railroad center. Railroads kind of fed all the places, I think. Nashville, as part of Tennessee, seceded during the American Civil War. In 1862, it was the first state capital in the Confederacy to be taken by Union forces. It was occupied through the war. After the war, the city began gradually reclaiming its stature. It became a center of trade and developed a manufacturing base. And then, as Nashville evolved in the 1960s, the music scene diversified, welcoming rock, pop, and other genres into the Nashville sound, and it transformed into countrypolitan. Artists like Bob Dylan and Johnny Cash came to Nashville to record, reflecting the city's expanding influence in the music industry. In 1960, Time reported that Nashville had nosed out Hollywood as the nation's second biggest record-producing center. According to Country Living magazine, Nashville has a reputation for being a prime destination for partiers. It's one of the top spots for bachelorette parties, after all. But while there are certainly many honky-tonks open until the wee hours of the morning and bar bikes riding up and down Broadway all day long, the historic city has even more to offer than you know about. Once you decide which famous motel to stay in, there are iconic venues featuring live shows with country music legends. It's not called Music City for nothing. Museums teeming with country music history, beautiful state parks with wildlife settings, adventure parks for kids, and shopping destinations will leave your luggage a lot heavier than when you started. And you can't leave Nashville without going on a Southern food tour. Whether you want a Nashville hot chicken sandwich, and it says, yes, the line at Hattie B's is worth it, barbecue biscuits, meatloaf, or other classic comfort foods, there's no way you'll leave hungry. So make your way down Honky Tonk Highway for a quintessential Nashville experience, or if you'd rather have a quiet night listening to country music, wait in line for the best hot chicken sandwich ever, enjoy a day at the distillery or winery, go ziplining, have a peaceful day at the state park, or take in natural views of hot air balloons, we're happy to report you can do that here too. So it sounds like fun. It sounds like there's a bunch of stuff to do there. Once again, I've never been there, but I would like to check it out someday. Maybe I just need to do a series of me going to all of these places I talk about. Of course, if I ever went to Nashville, I'd have to find out where Dolly lives and make a visit. I think this one's a little shorter than the others, maybe not by much, but hopefully you enjoy it. Who knows what all exciting things are going to come in the next year. I have several good ideas for shows, but I'm always looking for new ones. So if you have any ideas, let me know. Hope you have a happy New Year. Try not to party too hard. Don't forget to eat cabbage or black eyed peas or whatever your New Year's tradition is. I really don't have any, but you do whatever you do. As always, thanks for listening. Follow me on socials under Poison Appalachia. Check out my website. Like and rate me on whatever podcast platform you listen to if you can, and tell your friends about me. Talk to y'all next year.